Hi, everybody. So Rishi Sunak is still fighting for votes and he's still fighting for his job because it's not over yet. And rule number one of journalism is never assume. But he was on with us this morning and it was quite a big moment, I think.
I think it was maybe the last big moment that he will have during this election campaign. And that's what makes it so big because, look, there's lots of polls day by day. You can't move for polls. And publicly, Rishi Sunak says, he said to you, in fact, he still thinks he'll be Prime Minister on Friday after the general election. Privately, I can tell you, the Conservative campaign believe the polls and the Labour campaign believe the polls. And so Rishi Sunak needs something to change. And this was perhaps his big last opportunity to speak to the public about why he thinks things need to change.
I was struck by the fact that he has faced a much smaller electorate before when he stood as Conservative leader and lost to Liz Truss and then magically got the job anyway. So maybe in his head there's two outcomes and one of them is he's Prime Minister for another 5 years.
Let's see. Let's discuss it on this Sunday's episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Laura in the studio.
And it's Henry in the studio.
And it's the last Sunday before the campaign. And it does feel, Henry, doesn't it? There's a sort of crackle in the air. It's like this is the moment approaching.
Yeah, I think there's a genuine mood of excitement, but also trepidation that sort of seeps out of every WhatsApp I receive, every phone call I have with someone who's working on these campaigns. I think the sort of energy of a campaign, it feels like at the start, they're obviously very lively and very excited and all the things they've been planning for ages, they suddenly do them. And then you have the first debates and the first interviews and all of that. There was definitely a lull a couple of weeks ago when they realised, OK, well, the manifestos are out. Now you've just got to repeat yourselves. But the energy is ramping up again. But it's nervous energy now rather than sort of competitive energy.
And also, I've been told I'm wrong to expect average turnout, sort of up towards 70% in a general election. And you and Chris Mason have told me to brace for lower turnout.
I just think that's my hunch. We don't know, but my hunch is it will be lower. And a lot of people around the place sort of expect that it will probably be lower because we know there's that mood, not just of apathy, but kind of angry apathy.
I get really kind of smug about thinking that a vote is a precious thing.
It is a precious thing.
Putin kills his opponents, pushes them out of windows, poisons them and kills them. And we have a democratic system. And ultimately, I still think we should take time to be humbled by what's about to happen. In France, in the UK, we're great democracies and this is a great democratic moment. And I'm not going to be cynical.
I think it's always really hard to know whether low turnout is a sign of political failure or political success. Because we've actually had quite high turnout, especially since the 2014 Scottish referendum, which obviously had a massive turnout in Scotland, but also 2016 had very high turnout at the EU referendum. And after that, 2017 and 19 general elections, much higher than the preceding general elections. Whereas in 2001...
And now it's the low point. So 2001 is the low point. So quite often people go, oh, well, people care much less than they used to. I think that's nonsense. I think people care when they genuinely think there's something huge at stake, which is why the independence referendum, the EU referendum, people feel this is a profound moment and a profound question that they want to be part of giving the answer. And it will be fascinating to see, therefore, what happens next Thursday. Do people feel this is a profound moment that they want to take part in, that precious process of casting your vote? Or do they think, nah, not interested, because as the parties fear, particularly the Labour Party fear, lots of people listening to this now think that politics has lost its ability to be a force for good. But it's interesting. And Rishi Sunak this morning, sorry, Henry, you want to kind of...
Well, no, I was just going to say, Keir Starmer has been hammering this message to the shadow cabinet for, I think, the best part of 2 years. I remember a couple of years ago, a shadow cabinet minister leaving one of these meetings and saying that Keir Starmer had said to them, I think it was after he'd done a reshuffle, they have two opponents between then and the general election, which is now approaching. One is the Conservative Party and the other is the idea that the Labour Party can't make a difference. And I think, as well as seeing whether they've beaten the Conservative Party on Thursday, we will get a sense through turnout of whether they have beaten that idea that they can't make any difference and that they aren't any different.
And incumbency is something that you fight, don't you? This is my record, and then if you're fighting that, you say it's a rubbish record. You're about to release people from prisons. There are potholes. We've got a cost of living crisis. And Rishi Sunak says, this is all true, but I'm the guy who's brought inflation down from 11% to 2%. Mm-hmm. Obviously, his opponents say he didn't do that single-handedly. But when you had him in the sights and on the sofa, you've interviewed him many times. Did you see the fight that we've seen in him at the leaders' debate? Did you see the fight?
Yes, I think this was fighty Sunak, not I'm a mild-mannered, measured manager. And he is clearly, I felt he was very tense, quite sort of wound up and feeling the pressure of this being the last few days and feeling the pressure of someone who most of the polls suggest, and as Henry says, Tory HQ does pretty much believe the polls, someone who is trying to stop his party heading for like a complete asteroid landing on them from planet Earth, and who is trying to salvage something and end this in a way that might feel as if it is respectable. But it was very interesting. We started with that sort of sentiment in the public where people, as you said, Paddy, just so many people just feel that the country isn't working after such a long time of one party being in charge. And what we wanted to do this morning was sort of force him to confront that sentiment, if you like, not just to sit and fight about statistics. You can do that forever in a political interview. But I just want to read you some of the messages that we read to him, because our viewers had got in touch. Michael got in touch to say, why does my son's school not have enough money for glue sticks? Why do I have potholes on almost every road I drive on? Why are beaches closed when it rains and rivers polluted beyond measure?
Why can't I get a doctor's appointment? Sheila then wrote in, one of your viewers, our biggest worry is not about tax. It's about having the basics. The
basics. I mean, I was so struck by that message, just saying it's the basics. It's not like, oh, we'd like more from the government. There's a genuine sentiment among many people. Not everybody, newscasters. Let us know what you think. But this is what we wanted to put to Rishi Sunak. This is a genuine sentiment held by many of people, and this is what he had to say.
Of course it's been very difficult. When inflation rises to the highest level that we've seen in decades, when energy bills double because of a war in Ukraine, of course that has an impact on Sheila and everyone else. And that's why I'm working so hard to deliver people financial security. And I do think it is about tax, because people are working very, very hard. And I want them to be able to keep more of their money so that they can spend that on their families in the way that they want. And we've now been able to start doing that after a difficult few years, which is very positive. So everyone in work on average is receiving...
I think you saw in those questions and Rishi Sunak's answer one of the fault lines of this general election campaign, because he is trying to make this general election about the last 18 months, i.e. the time in which he's been Prime Minister, and the next 5 years, what he wants to do going forwards. And members of the public, members of the electorate, keep yanking him back to the last 14 years. And the Labour Party obviously wants to make the campaign about that as well. And I thought one of the most fascinating bits of the interview was when you said to him, is the country in a better state than it was 14 years ago when the Conservatives came into office? And he said yes, of course he has to say that. And then he started talking about what he'd done in the past 18 months.
And those poor primary school children in England who are better readers, and hats off to them, but every Tory minister mentions them every single day, and it feels like, to me, like there's a lot of pressure on the 7-year-olds as they make their way through Cat in a Hat.
And beyond that, I'm not sure Rishi Sunak has ever come up with a way in which he feels comfortable defending the record of the past 14 years. I don't think he wants to. Not necessarily because he doesn't think it's defensible, and not because he doesn't think it's defensible, but because he thinks that he's standing as Rishi Sunak, not as the sort of combined effect of David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. But it's very difficult for him when people do feel like this is an election that is recording a verdict on the Conservative Party as well as its current leader.
Yeah, because you're effectively asking me as a voter, I need 19 years. So I need 19 years. And then the warnings in the papers saying if you vote Labour, you're voting Labour for the rest of your life, the Tory opponent. You'll never have another party. And when you look at the tax question, what I think we've nailed on Newscast is that two things are true at the same time. Taxes are going up under Labour, and taxes are gone up under the Tories, and will continue to go up under the Tories if they stay in, because of the threshold and because of the fact that they've raised taxes to the highest burden since the 1940s. Those things are both true at the same time. And if you're a voter, Henry, trying to say, if you did think it was about tax, Labour's ruled out the three big levers of tax raising.
Yeah, and that's been one of the big dynamics of the campaign, is the Conservative Party sort of, doing this sort of raffle of taxes where, sort of spin the ball and then, what comes out? Inheritance tax on farmland. Are you going to rule that out? Challenging them one by one. But and I think in some ways it actually has been quite effective.
Yeah.
But the reason they've been left doing that sort of, spin the wheel, what is it today, is because Labour was so adamant from the start that the three main taxes, income tax, national insurance, VAT, they were going to meet the Conservatives' pledge right there. Of course, one of the dynamics that I'm sure we're going to talk about on lots of Sundays going forwards, should Labour win the general election, is whether in so doing, Labour have held a few or several dozen seats that they wouldn't otherwise have won at the general election, but might they have constrained their room for manoeuvre fiscally too far for a potential Labour government? I mean, that would be one of the fascinating dynamics if they win on Thursday.
It may well be, but I would just say, and I'll put this on the record before, and I'll just say it again, and call me an old wizzled cynic.
I would never use the word cynic.
You call me something much worse than that. Successive chancellors, Conservative and Labour chancellors, when they hit a problem and their calculator is showing 0.00000 money left in the piggy bank, what do? They change the rules. Now, I'm not saying that because I have prior insight on either Jeremy Hunt, if he stayed on as Chancellor, if the Tories managed to turn things round, or if Rachel Reeves becomes Chancellor. This is some secret plan that has been whispered to me. I'm just saying, with my wizened years of experience, in campaigns, people treat the fiscal rules, the spending and borrowing rules, as if they are carved in stone. And I've seen plenty of chancellors take a giant blaster to that tablet of stone and blast it to bits, and change the rules and find some money down the back of the sofa. And it's interesting because this campaign has been so dominated by this trap of their own choosing for both parties. And actually, chancellors often just go, well, that's a bit hard to change the rules.
And it is quite clear that if Labour win the general election, they are going to get in and they are going to say, oh, wow, the books are even worse than we thought they'd be. Now, Paul Johnson from the IFS says that's ridiculous. The books are all public. The Treasury is very transparent. They can see the state it's going to be. But I remember actually ages ago, could be a year ago, having a discussion with someone very, very senior in the Labour Party who said David Cameron and George Osborne won the 2015 general election in the 10 days after they won the 2010 general election. In that time where they just did announcement after announcement, press conference after press conference, talking about what a rubbish state they had found the country in. And Labour have learnt from that. And if they win this general election, they are going to do the same.
I've had discussions with people about how they might plan to do that if they win. And someone said to me yesterday, peel the carpets back to look at the floorboards. And there are discussions about how they will communicate that message if they win, to say to the public, it's worse than we thought.
Well, because the IFS who you mentioned saying that the statistics are there if you look for them in the Treasury, it's the same IFS that says the detail is not there from these two parties, the Conservative and the Labour Party. They call it a conspiracy of silence about what you're going to actually do when you get the carpet up.
I know, and I know that I annoy economists all the time by doing outrageous things about using metaphors. But economists and politicians are not the same, okay? Politicians are realistically, in real life, rarely going to win a campaign when they say, roll up, everyone. This is going to be horrendous and you're not going to get anything and I'm going to take away all your sweeties. Now, there's an exception, actually, 2010, obviously the Tories, but they didn't win a majority, said, deficit, Gordon Brown, sell the gold, disaster. Actually, there's hardly any money to spend. But in general, it's not a way to win an election or to try to hold on to power, to say to people it's going to be horrible gruel and a bit of gravel for your pudding if you're lucky. That's not to say that it's not important to explain the economic picture, and it's important to point out that the main parties have been shy of giving very much economic detail. But it's also, there's a bit, for me, and I can say this as a grumpy old hack, there is a bit of sort of... what's the word?
Well, it's unrealistic to
expect in a campaign. It doesn't mean it's okay before people scream. It doesn't mean okay. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying that people getting their knickers in a twist this way is about something that's not unrealistic to expect them to do.
And I agree with you that it's unrealistic. I think we should also think, partly us as journalists, but much more us and the country as voters, why is it unrealistic? If the country is not ready to have a serious conversation about the ways in which things might have to be tough, and if politicians, as I agree with you, correctly have assessed that it would not be in their interest to say so, perhaps that's because we voters, who get very high and mighty about politicians not levelling with us, are not ready for them to level.
We don't want to hear it. And actually, there's a really interesting piece by Matthew Syed in Sunday Times this morning saying exactly this point, that basically in the West, we want to think we can turn the taps on and there'll be milk and honey, and we don't want to hear about debt. And debt, like lots of the things we tried to raise this morning, actually climate change and Brexit, we tried to do a lot this morning with Labour and the Tories on subjects that haven't been much discussed in the campaign. The size of the national debt, one Tory former minister was saying to me the other day, kind of really wound up and cross, that people have not been talking about the sky-high level of the national debt, which I think is either about to hit 100% of GDP or just has, and I can't quite remember, but it's really interesting.
I mean, on Brexit,
yeah.
Nigel Farage appeared on Newsnight and said Brexit had been a failure. Mm-hmm. He subsequently changed those words to say been a failure because the Conservatives didn't do it correctly. But he did say it'd been a failure. Now he's back. Now, Rishi Sunak is a Brexiteer, and actually Brexit itself has not been given the airtime that the D-Day non-appearance had, that the gambling had. I've not heard the parties held to the flame about Brexit. What progress did you make this morning?
Well, so on Brexit, we asked Labour and the Tories about Brexit this morning. And on Brexit, there is the overwhelming consensus from economists. And of course, there is a big range here. But the consensus from economists is that Brexit has made it harder for the UK to make ends meet in the long term, right? That is the economic consensus. The OBR has said it. All sorts of experts have said it. Rishi Sunak's old boss, Goldman Sachs, has said it about the long-term damage. And we put this to Rishi Sunak this morning. Even one of his political friends, one of his ministers, Kevin Hollingrake, said on the radio the other day, yes, it has made trading more difficult. Rishi Sunak just did not want to touch that with a barge pole, and I mean a very long and spiky barge pole. He was like, he just did almost everything he could to avoid addressing that point. We weren't trying to get him to say, oh, it was a terrible thing and the wrong thing, but would he acknowledge the economic consensus now that Brexit has longer term made it harder for the UK to trade around the world? He, of course, no surprise to newscasters, came back with evidence of new trade deals that he says that they've signed. He was citing recent statistics which suggest that the UK has been doing better recently than other EU countries. But Neil got in touch to say this interview is painful. Does Rishi Sunak realise his tetchy and short-tempered response to questions is a terrible look? I mean, what did it look like to you, Henry? Because I never, I was sitting there thinking about what I'm asking. What does it look when you were watching it?
I mean, he was feisty for sure, which I thought was a continuation of his approach to Wednesday's debate in Nottingham, where we were both watching from the spin room. And I thought it worked very well for him. But it's a fine line. In fact, I think I wrote something for the BBC Live page during the debate saying it's a very fine line. If you're on the right side of it, you look passionate, you look up for it, you look like you know how high the stakes are. If you just nudge onto the other side of that line, you can look a bit rude. And I think that's going to be in the eye of the beholder here. I mean, look, I think one other thing we should say is the very fact that he was there on your programme on the Sunday before and Sir Keir Starmer was not and sent Pat McFadden, the ultimate sort of park the bus merchant.
Hang on. I'm not Pat McFadden. Can you clarify what you mean by park the bus merchant?
Jose Mourinho, when he was Chelsea manager, used to accuse I actually can't remember if he accused other teams or extolled his own virtues for saying that they would turn up and park the bus, i.e. aim to concede as little as possible while not necessarily scoring many goals.
OK, so you're really saying he's a safe pair of hands, is what you're kind of...
That's what sorry, my head is so in Euros mode. I'm already at the barbecue that I'm going to later to watch England demolish Slovakia playing Southgate.
So can we here on Newscast hear some of these exchanges? Can we hear Prime Minister and Pat McFadden, or are we not going to be doing that?
Well, we probably should. But I do want to make the point, though, to newscasters, because people might be in touch and wonder why. We absolutely invited Keir Starmer to come on the programme today. We've invited him to come on the programme throughout the campaign. And today he has declined to come on the programme. So if people are wondering, it was not a choice where we said, come on, Rishi Sunak, do not come on, Keir Starmer. We absolutely invited the Labour leader of the Prime Minister to come on the programme, and he chose not to. Just to make that completely clear before the conspiracy theorists do their thing. And we then went on to ask Rishi Sunak about the astonishing row, really, on Friday after a reform activist from Nigel Farage's party used appalling racial slurs about him. Now, Rishi Sunak explained to us that he felt there had to be called out, even though he hadn't wanted to do it, but they had to call out that terrible language. But some of our viewers had got in touch to say, well, his approach to racism in the Tory party hadn't always been zero tolerance, and they wanted to know why the Conservative Party had continued to take money from Frank Hester, the Tory donor, even though he had made racist remarks about the MP, Diane Abbott.
So I draw this all together, the remarks that were made by Frank Hester about Diane Abbott and the shameful remarks that were made about the Prime Minister's background, to say that the well of public conversation in the United Kingdom is polluted.
How can we expect good people to stand for Parliament? I mean, that is a big question that we've talked about over the last few years in the context of abuse of MPs. I don't think that question is going away. You know, in Parliament, over the last few days, they've been setting up sort of welcome packs and welcome desks for MPs. And among that is a presentation about the ways in which they should or could instantly protect their security upon becoming MPs. And that's clearly a sensible thing for them to be advised on instantly. But my God, what a grim fact that that is one of the first things they get told on what must be one of the proudest days of their lives,
so
arriving in Parliament as an MP.
It links to leadership in these parties. If someone in your party is overtly racist, you come out and you call it out. That's how the system works. And it would work in journalism. If you're wrong, you have to come out and say you're wrong. That's how the system works. And so I think there is a public record comparison that voters want to know. Did Frank Hester saying racist things about Diane Abbott get called out in the same way as a man identified with reform? There's subsequently been a row about in what way he was working with reform, saying all these things. Was that called out equally? And I think that's kind of what you were seeking to get an answer for.
Yeah, and I think Rishi Sunak essentially said it was OK to take the money from Frank Hester because Frank Hester apologised. The difference here is about whether or not reform and that activist had apologised and apologised in the same way. So his answer is essentially they're not the same, because in one there was a clear sense of contrition, in the other there wasn't really. But look, it's complicated, and I think it's one of these issues that viewers and listeners and newscasters will take sometimes very, very different views. But it was interesting to me, I think not surprising, but notable. We had a very strong response from our viewers in advance of the programme this morning saying, please ask Rishi Sunak about this, because we hate what happened to him, but we do not necessarily look at the record of the Conservative Party in this area and think that they have always taken the right steps. One of the things, though, in the context of all of this about trust and people looking at politicians is about being able to believe what they say. And one of the things we know people have been confused about in this campaign is how can they believe Labour's promise on energy? So one of their big policies, which sources tell me is really popular in focus groups, is having this energy company called GB Energy, which would be publicly owned, and it would invest in energy projects that would then end up
contributing to growth. But the promise that they've put alongside that is that it would save everybody 300 quid a year. But we asked Pat McFadden actually how they get to that statistic, because it's not quite as simple as the manifesto might suggest.
That's an estimate based on current prices compared to what we can get to through generation through renewable energy.
So it's an estimate of what you hope we might get to in 6 years' time. So that doesn't sound like something you should be putting all over a leaflet and a poster and making a solemn promise to people in a manifesto that they'll have coming off their monthly budget.
This is a good way to illustrate the benefit of transitioning to renewable energy, because if we don't do that, we are left, as we saw a couple of years ago, at the mercy of international oil and gas prices. We're also at the mercy of who controls those fossil fuels, and we saw the kind of energy blackmail that Vladimir Putin attempted to put on Europe.
Now, it's not true to say it's an estimate based on current prices. It's actually an estimate based on prices from July and September last year, when energy was more expensive. And it's an estimate not based on Labour's plans. It's an estimate put together by a group, a think tank type of outfit, based on guesstimates of what might happen if we have 98% of decarbonisation by 2030. So it's an aim, but it is not a solid estimate, even though it's not a solid figure, even though it is a solid promise from the Labour Party. And you can see Pat McFadden there kind of go, oh, it's an illustration. But it's actually a manifesto promise.
And there's also questions that I still don't think are completely resolved, although Pat McFadden, at least in the context of your programme, gave you a clear answer on whether GB Energy is going to generate its own energy or whether it is going to invest across the private sector in certain projects. He said the latter.
I'm not
Other
sure Ed
points during the
Miliband
election
has
campaign,
the same
other Labour
view.
people have said slightly different things. It's quite a complicated policy area, but I'm a bit confused.
Yeah,
and I've been following this quite closely.
OK, I think we've been following it very closely. I feel we're near the end in every sense.
Thank God for that.
Of the campaign and of Newscast, and inevitably it's over to us as voters, and some of us will be motivated by very detailed policy decisions, but it is an emotional issue for some people as well, voting.
Yeah,
Sometimes
absolutely.
you make up your mind days, weeks in advance before the election's even called. So we'll all be here again, and you'll be all over our TV, I'm pleased to say.
Yes, I'm afraid so. Thursday night, we'll be going on air at 5 to 10, just before the exit poll. Just
And you'll be on the radio.
terribly exciting.
Yes, we'll be going on air at 9:45, I believe. So if you want to steal a march, or no, we're stealing the march, I don't know. Anyway, you can listen to 10 minutes of that,
And then-
watch a bit of
and
Laura,
then
then you
switch
can go
over
to
to
bed,
BBC One. Obviously.
listen to my Nick Robinson, Rachel Burden and Professor Philip Cowley's dulcet tones through the night. Anyway,
Goodness
both
me.
great options.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Newscast from the BBC.